Hey, digital wildcatters. Welcome to another edition of BDE. You like the backdrop, Mark?
I love it.
Yeah, I was in a panic.
Where's Collide? Where does it say Collide?
Yeah, we need the Clyde stamped across it. But no, I was in a panic because, we moved to the new offices and I'm like, where's my big Chuck Yates needs a job banner? But it is supposedly folded away in a corner and Jacob needs to set me up a remote podcasting studio.
Yeah, well, after we broke the seal on the new studio last time, back to remote, we had Kirk on the hook for up until the last minute, but business intervened, and so
good luck on your negotiations, Kirk.
Good luck on your negotiations, Kirk.
All right. So
what's going on?
The girlfriend claims she wants to retire one day to Spain or Portugal. And tell me why that might not be a good idea.
I have someone in my family whose spouse is Portuguese, and there have been trips and contemplations of maybe part retirement in Portugal. So I think we got a good glimpse of reality with respect to the state of the grid. And so on Monday around noon or thereabouts, Spain time, there was a series of upsets on the Spanish grid that ultimately led to a complete blackout that cascaded and caused the same in Portugal, and there was some impact in France. I don't recall all the specific outages relative to
they're interconnected there.
Yeah, there's limited interconnect, but in general, the European grid is highly interconnected, unlike here in the U.S., which we've spent quite a bit of time talking about. And one of the first things I did was, hey, I got to reread Shorting the Grid by Meredith Angwin, because there are a lot of, and I know Colin hates acronyms, but there are a lot of key acronyms being thrown around in the discussion. And that book is an outstanding layperson translation or non-electrical engineer translation of, some of the dynamics that are at play. And the somewhat ironic thing is that this event occurred the week after Spain had touted the fact that 100% of its generation, I forget over what time period, whether it was a day or the week, 100% of its generation supply was from renewables. And at the time of the blackout, you had, I think, 5% of thermal in the form of a combined cycle spinning at that time. And further, there was an event related to renewables that I've seen that apparently there was a huge or a massive 20 gigawatt solar dump on the system. And so what happens, and it can be caused by various factors, and this is kind of amateur electrical engineer, power line guy, is something called induced atmospheric vibration. So the high voltage lines run, or the whole system runs, in a fairly tight band around a 50 hertz frequency. And that band of tolerance is literally from 49.5 hertz to 50.5 hertz. In the old days, grid resilience and stability was really a function of what's called inertia, or the constant of inertia, which is provided by mostly thermal, some hydropower, and to a lesser extent nuclear, which has got just a slower response time because of steam turbines are slower than combustion turbines. But basically, a response time measured in milliseconds when there starts to be disturbances or deviations from frequency, the natural inertia or the embedded inertia of the spinning machinery online can respond quickly and dampen or modulate that. And with, there's a lot of different threads being investigated as the cause, what caused the the IVA, or excuse me, the IAV, the induced atmospheric vibration, to then really signal that the spinning machinery that was online, it accelerates in response, and then there are safeguards that cause that generation to trip offline, and then it cascades, and you ultimately get in an interconnected situation that stability cascade and essentially black out the entire grid.
Yeah, Campbell Faulkner, who's always my go-to power guy. I've had him on Chuck Job a couple of times. I mean, he said this because, we almost, with Winter Storm Uri, we almost brought down the grid, ERCOT in Texas. And he came on, walked us through it. And he basically said, look, I'm not playing politics here in any way, shape, or form. I'm not being anti-renewable. It's just at the end of the day, when you don't have spinning equipment, it changes the nature of the electricity, and it's simply physics. It will potentially bring down the grid at some point, and I think this just goes to the point of, this is really hard to do, what we're trying to do. It's not as simple as, if we just got rid of big bad oil and we use solar and wind, everything would be hunky-dory, peachy keen. This is just really hard to do. A lot of physics, a lot of money, and we just need to have intellectual discussion, honest discussion about, what trade-offs are truly worth it.
Yeah, and the substitute for rotating equipment inertia, the embedded inertia or the natural inertia, is, in the sense of renewables, is that they are replaced, or the rotating equipment inertia is in place by inverters or large-scale battery storage that can respond quickly, discharge quickly, and respond quickly to keep that vibration, for a more succinct term, out of getting worse, so it goes out of the band, which then triggers the safeguards that shut down the generation to protect the equipment, protect the grid. This IEV can be caused by electromagnetic wave propagation, wind turbulence, all of these things on these 400 kW lines that traverse over long distances. They're exposed to a lot of things that potentially can cause that. But my read of the situation was the weather was pretty mild. There doesn't seem to have been a wind event, and you did have a pretty big slug of renewables as part of the gen stack at that time. And the fact that this happened in late April in Spain is pretty eyebrow raising. But to your point, the politicization of all of this, when these events happen, whether it's Uri or this, or Meredith Angwin talks about a cold snap in Vermont, in New England, where she lives, back in 2018, the real issue was the fact that there's such limited gas pipeline capacity and supply. There's a very to be redundant, a very finite amount. And when you get into a cold situation, a dangerously cold situation, guess what has priority on natural gas? It's your gas-fired furnaces.
Grandmother warm. Yeah.
And so, fortunately, at that time, and most people weren't aware, at least in the region, you had dual fuel thermal facilities that had oil storage. And in one case, that storage got down to 1 day of coverage. And fortunately, the weather broke and got warmer. But, that really had nothing to do with renewables. It had to do with the lack of kind of synchronous build out of the grid and the more balanced distribution of generation. And there's a lot of other things, and I'm not qualified to comment on those things, certainly from a technical standpoint. But, ERCOT's is in the same situation. with respect to the massive amount of wind and solar build out that we've had over the last 10, 15 years. Battery storage is catching up. I looked at ERCOT yesterday, and I think the last time I looked, we were over 9 gigawatts of energy storage, and we're now over 11, at least in nameplate. And so are we getting what essentially constitutes the factor, the technology that needs to mimic rotating equipment inertia? Are we getting that caught up with, the proportions of generation that don't inherently have inertia to make sure that we have a stable grid? So it's a hugely complex issue, and I think events like this certainly jolt the policymakers and politicians into at least talking about it. But again, there's still two very polarized sides of this debate and discussion going on. There were, I think, some deflections into, hey, we're going to investigate this to see if it was a cyber attack, et cetera. So is the problem solved? I think far from it. Yeah.
Neil Dykman came on Chuck Job, I'm going to say 6 months ago, which probably means it's longer than that. But Neil said he wasn't saying this is what's going to happen, but he did say what could happen. And he literally said if we wanted to, we could rebuild our grid today, 100% solar, and that battery storage was there and economic enough to complement solar and replace it all. And I don't know enough about it. I let him say his piece, and I tried to punch holes in his argument where I could, but I'm not enough of an expert to do it. But anyway, so I tried to punch holes in Neil's story, but I can't really, just because I don't know enough. But at the end of the day, can we have a thoughtful, honest discussion and just spend the dollars once, as opposed to patchworking, doing this, fighting amongst each other, and the like. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of Spain when they do their debriefs.
The lurching kind of incremental approach to all this over the last couple of decades has been very capital inefficient, which has a direct impact on ratepayers, which you can see reflected in most kind of electricity price trends over the long term. And so in the regulated areas, the more generation you put into it, like every other asset, you've got a high value asset, they're guaranteed a rate of return on it. And guess what? If the ratepayer base doesn't increase proportionally, then you've got higher per ratepayer charges to cover that, the value of that asset and the guaranteed rate of return on top of that. And again, it's a lot more complicated between those that opted out of kind of the RTO, ISO development or the deregulation back in 25 years ago versus the areas that, and I'm currently in one, I just learned, that is not in an RTO, which is Arizona, I believe. I need to do some more research along those lines, but to your point, we need this. We seem to have sped past this critical aspect or feature of the grid that essentially has a safe minimum standard of inertia. Now, they're going to be weather related and other extreme events that no system is. You wouldn't want to spend the money to put a system in that's got 100% reliability. That's not feasible, and that's horrendously costly. But at any rate, I just thought quickly back to Uri and other events when in our recent discussions about the grid when when this happened on Monday.
So real quick, while we're in Europe, well, I guess technically England's not in Europe; they Brexited, but we'll go to the island. Tony Blair came out last night and actually said, hey, we need to really rethink this net zero thing. Doesn't look like potentially it should be our end goal in these time frames. I don't have his exact quote, but he cast a shadow. And what the girlfriend, the British girlfriend, told me was, say what you want about Tony Blair. Tony Blair is probably the best politician in England in terms of having a read on the people and getting out in front of stuff. And so, they're having local elections, I believe today on the island. And so Tony Blair coming out the night before saying that may actually disrupt kind of the narrative coming out of England in terms of we got to be 100% net zero. We're not going to drill for fossil fuels anymore, et cetera, because ultimately the people are starting to revolt in terms of higher prices, reliability, et cetera.
Yeah, and a more acute, and I think contemporaneous example kind of moved west to Canada with what happened with the election on Monday with Carney winning, when a short while ago, I think many wouldn't have placed a bet in that direction. But again, we talked about really the nationalistic and national security response that really drove that outcome, which I think we predicted along with others, not taking any major credit for that prediction. But I think what you're going to see, using Canada as an analogous situation to the UK, and change the sentiment, even though we have, a globalist WEF, GFANZ investment banker now at the top of the Canadian government. This was also predicted by others, but you're seeing, for example, Danielle Smith, who's the premier of Alberta, stand up and say, look, we're not going to continue to have the Canadian Constitution ignored. We're done with confiscatory things like equalization and a host of other more politically charged issues, which I think is going to give cover for the new Canadian leadership to start to quietly, or maybe more softly, undo some of the things that have been obstructing things like infrastructure permitting. We've talked about this before.
Help me here real quick, because I was talking to Laura this morning, and either one of our listeners shoot me a text about it, or Mark cleared up for me. How again did Trump change the dynamic in this election? I mean, I don't think either side was sitting there saying, yes, we want to be the 51st state. So I don't understand how, just outside Trump derangement syndrome, this even mattered. I mean, how was one side able to tag, I guess, the Liberal Party? How were they able to tag the conservatives with Trump?
Well, I think it's just fundamental, at least optics or perception of policy alignment, deregulation, permitting infrastructure, anti-climate type of broad strokes. And so, the people that are a lot more insightful about the whims of Canadian politics would suggest that, Trump was such, it was kind of shock and awe. And maybe that has mostly to do with the tariffs, to a lesser extent on border security. And so he is such kind of anti to the liberal Canadian platform, it's easy to pin all of that on, can't even pronounce, Pierre Poilievre, the conservative candidate who not only lost that election, also lost his seat in Parliament.
Which is just absurd. After I saw him eating that apple 6 months ago, being interviewed, I really thought that's your next superstar. That is your next global leader. And just would love to get. Maybe there's a Canadian political expert of some sort. I'll reach out to the network in Canada, because I'd love to just hear a dissection of all this, because this is the craziest fall I think I've seen. You know,
I think the thing I read about this turnabout is that, and apparently I saw it somewhere just this morning, Carney has already reached out with the prospects of making a trade deal. He already reached out to Trump. Trump was congratulatory, and I think they realize with what Alberta and Saskatchewan have been doing for a while, and the premiers of those provinces in the West, we should have a real Canadian on to talk about this. But I do think that
Stacey, Rory, somebody, come on.
I do think that the Liberals can shift pretty markedly from, policies of obstructive regulation. Nothing gets built, nothing gets done. Our national security is threatened by things like tariffs, and we've got to get moving on national security first, so everything else goes by the wayside. And there's a pretty malleable media that we'll inevitably see some protests on some of these things if the Liberals say, well, we're going to streamline permitting, we're going to get moving on infrastructure, national security is a priority over climate. The media is not going to cover it.
Right.
But it's almost a cartoonish contrast with the profile that everybody talks about that Carney is. He's a WEF guy. He's a globalist. He was one of the architects of the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and on and on and on. And this is a really kind of subtle and clever way of the populace more getting their way after years of pushback and all the things we read and saw back during COVID, particularly with things like the trucker strike, et cetera. And I don't understand the first thing about equalization payments, but I do know that there's a lot of Western provincial payments to the central provinces because of just the inherent natural resource wealth and advantages that they have.
We'll be gracious to Carney and claim this is Nixon going to China. That only only a liberal could provide that. Yeah, exactly. I am not a crook. All right, let's jump back to Europe. Sounds like the flood of mineral deals in Ukraine will be the next thing we'll see a lot of business plans on, get a lot of cold calls about, see tweets about.
Yeah, I glanced at that and, okay, so we have, at least in principle, an agreement on essentially a 50-50 revenue sharing for what I call resource development and reconstruction. I haven't looked at the details of it, but I think what's starting to come clear as people focus on this a little bit more is that you've got this misguided notion, and Javier Blas has been pretty good about repeatedly pointing this out, that this is not about rare earths. Ukraine is not a kind of a dominant player in rare earths mining and processing. This is about things that are more fundamental or more traditional, like graphite and titanium in more of a new generation lithium. And let's not kid ourselves, it's about oil and gas too. And I think there is some motive here that, as we saw with what I call drill by OPEC proxy, the notion that we have influence and control over, pretty significant oil and gas resources, and what that can do to the global supply demand balance is just another play here. My take on it is realities and implementation's a long way away, because the Russians, Sergei Lavrov, who has been very pointed and explicit recently, saying, look, the terms of Russia have essentially gone up and they've expanded. We want all the territory. We want an explicit no NATO guarantee. And then, I don't understand the details around this either, but there's something in the language around maybe backing off by the NATO countries that immediately border Russia. So there's a long way to go to get to this. I think what was in the honeymoon days of the first few days of the administration, there's a long way to go. And my question is, if we get to some kind of fragile agreement or treaty or ceasefire, how long is it before U.S. companies are going to want to put capital and humans on the ground in Ukraine?
I wouldn't be Russian there. No pun intended.
Russian to...
I thought that was pretty good. Right,
R-U-S-H-I-N-G. Yeah, it was very good.
There we go. I saw a lady, and I wish I could remember her name. She was a Russian expert. She was on Fox News, I believe, sometime this weekend. And she had an interesting point on all this. She said, look, a decade ago, Putin began, in effect, building his economy so that sanctions wouldn't hurt him. He sanction-proofed his economy. He went to a wartime economy. He's got way more in the way of bombs and missiles and anything we have. And she said, we just need to understand, we literally have no leverage in this situation. I mean, we can put all the sanctions we want on Putin. It's not going to matter to him. He's got more bombs, so we can throw stuff at him. Doesn't matter. He's got, 10 times the drones we do, and he'll just keep firing away. And so Putin really does hold a lot more cards here than we realize. And so, I guess we're kind of seeing that play out in terms of the terms keep going up every day. The one thing I will say is, and I kind of hate to do this because I've become more an isolationist in my old age, but I ultimately think the world's a better place when we're involved somehow. And so I think us ultimately walking away from this, I know we've threatened it, I think would have ultimately been a bad thing. And so I actually like seeing the mineral deal get done, even if it's not really a thing. It's more symbolic in nature. You'll definitely have, you had idiots that went to Oklahoma to settle it when they opened up settlements there back in the 1800s. And, you had people go out and drilled wildcat wells in West Texas and stuff happened. So somebody's going to go over to Ukraine and start digging up something. Now, will those be the people we'll defend? Maybe not. But at the end of the day, I do think we have to remain involved here.
Yeah, and this is more of a political observation, and we talked about it last time, which is the strategic objectives are sound, whether it's relating to increasing the security around critical industries by bringing production and manufacturing back to the U.S., or, in the case of Russia, Ukraine, I think the part of the deal of the negotiating strategy puts some kind of indirect pressure back on Putin to whether it's not exactly kind of NATO membership. We're moving ahead with the strategy of increasing our economic presence, which is a deterrent, hopefully. But the tactics are such that, the electorate looks around, and certainly the media looks around and say, well, nothing's gotten done. It's been a week. You've had a week to actually get something done. Just like, promises of we're going to end this thing in 24 hours in the first 100 days. The trade deals need to start coming fast and furious. And here we are, 29 days past April 2nd, which is Liberation Day, when all the chaos broke loose. And because of the short cycle of important American elections in terms of policy making, namely Congress, which is every 2 years, there's a lot of, well, you didn't get that done type of rebuttal to the debate. And so if we keep lurching back and forth between effective control of meaningful pieces of the government, then it's hard to continue to turn the ship.
Yeah. No, and I'll say this to your point, to move it into politics. I do think, if ultimately you've got basically till the end of the year, I think, if you're Trump, and if you're able to get a peace deal done in Ukraine, your big beautiful bill done, and I'm certain in that they're not going to cut Social Security, they're not going to cut Medicare, but they'll make the tax cuts permanent. If he gets that done, and you see any sort of bounce back in the economy, which I think you will. I mean, I think economic growth has halted just because of the uncertainty. And you see all these announcements of the various people building factories here now and all. You potentially could have a red wave. Conversely, if you don't get those things done, then you could have a blue wave. And I don't think there's going to be a tweener. I don't think you're going to wind up with the Republicans pick up 2 seats or the Democrats pick up 4 seats. I think you're talking plus 30 either direction on this. Yeah. And so, and where's that coming from? I think it's coming from Trump's ego. I think he thinks he knows what he's doing these days now that he's kind of served for, call it 5 years, and has his team in place. And plus, he's not going to run again. I know he trolls the Democrats with Trump 2028, but he's not going to run again, and he knows it.
We need to take the volatility out of our political outcomes, I guess, is a way to think about it, because these big strategic shifts and pivots that I think are fundamentally needed in the right direction don't operate on six monthly cycles, and we are 6 months away, which is either a long time in terms of collective memory, or a very short amount of time in terms of getting things done that you can point to that will ensure success in the midterms coming up here in November.
Although I do think that ultimately the electorate's probably more forward-looking than we give them credit for. If you go from 1 to 3, you're feeling better and looking like you're going to go to 6 or 7 than if you're at 7 and you go down to 6.
Right.
So
that's fair.
I do think momentum matters in politics. Real quick, let's hit carbon capture.
Yeah, this became somewhat personally topical on another front, but I thought it was interesting in looking at the CCUS, which is the adopted path of choice for certainly Exxon and others who are responsive to and somewhat participating in IRA-based incentives. And just had a conversation this week about, okay, well, the CCUS credit or the 45Q credit is a pretty significant feature of the IRA. And this article that we've linked really talks about what I call the headwinds for CCUS. And predicting the risk or predicting the possibility of that being part of what gets cut in Doge and maybe rollback of some of the provisions of the IRA is a pretty big deal, right? You're looking at, for geologic formation storage, you're looking at tax credits on the order of, the base credit is $17 a ton. And if you have something like a wage and apprenticeship criterion met, that increases to $85 a ton. I don't know exactly what that means, but I think of the small CCUS projects, I know that those revenues are being generated on something that approaches or is more than $80 a ton. So if that's make or break, and these things in large scale, particularly in Exxon's case, we're talking about tens, if not approaching $100 billion of ultimate investment, right? And so if you do a rug pull here with 45Q credits because, it's cost reduction as part of a Doge initiative, then I know you can't insure against this unprecedented risk, but how do you think about that as a CCUS developer? Plus, there are other things going on. I think there's, in CCUS, injection wells are Class 6 EPA permits, and you can go look at what's required in your permit application. But there's like I want to say 160 permit application backlog at the EPA. I think they've approved like 6 to 8 of them. And the predicted timeline to approval is 3 to 6 years based upon the pace. In states like Texas and Mississippi, where there are, significant activities going on around CCUS, Exxon with the Denbury stuff in Mississippi, and then all the Gulf Coast stuff in Texas, those states are trying to get primacy, whereby they have at least as stringent standards as the EPA, but they can get to the permitting review and approval process much faster if they are the primary authority.
So Colin and I were downtown selling AI software, and we had a break, and we just popped into the office of one of our favorite people on the planet. Don't know if I can say his or her name. So I'll tell you what they said, but I'll keep the name to myself. We were all sitting there going, direct air capture is just the stupidest thing on the planet. It's never going to make any sense. And this person actually pushed back and said, you know what? The desire of big tech, Microsoft, Google, to hit their net zero targets is real, and they're willing to pay for that. And maybe in effect, it's the advertising marketing budget. They want to say we truly are net zero and all. And this person was, do not sleep on the voluntary market for this to actually happen. And so this person should know. And so anyway, it was interesting to hear.
That's a great observation. And I do think that there are, I do think there's going to be a voluntary market. But developers of CCUS projects, let's say they're paired with an off-grid gas-fired generation serving a data center. Well, if that feature is available, CCUS feature is available, the risk will be mitigated ultimately in a more attractive or premium price power. If the 45Q credits go away, it's kind of what's the price, what's the indifference price in terms of the power to cover all these nice to have features. I'm not required to do this, but it has kind of goodwill value to me as a Silicon Valley player, data center developer, right? So I think we'll find more indirect market solutions because we're not talking about, particularly in the case of direct air capture, we're not talking about trivial amounts of capital to get scale facilities built.
No, that's right.
And nobody knows that better than Oxy.
Exactly. All right.
And by the way, I mean, back to, we're trying not to politicize renewables. It's the same on an even more basic level. I'm all for pollution mitigation. And I think the NOx and SOx rules have got a lot of noble objectives behind them, but we just make things so horrendously costly in terms of getting through the permitting and approval process. So if you had some longer term horizon of clarity, then those investments are worth making. And if people see value, as you pointed out, or as the person you met with pointed out, they're going to continue to pay for that value, whatever it is. And CCUS is no different.
I always find it very ironic, the people that are telling us that Trump's tariffs are leading to uncertainty, therefore stifling economic development, never seem to turn the light on permitting and the regulatory environment as causing uncertainty and disrupting economic development. So, well, cool. Hey, everybody, thanks for watching today. If you liked it, please share it with a friend, subscribe, leave us comments. Remember, my ego is very fragile. All right, Mark, we'll see you next week.
All right, brother.
Thanks, guys.